All right, welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, Bitcoin pleb, and all-around raging capitalist. And in today's video, I'm very excited to be bringing you something that several of you have requested that goes to the tune of, hey, all this Bitcoin stuff is great, but how does it really work? And so in today's video, I'm going to do my humble attempt at answering that question. We're going to cover a ton of ground in this video, so buckle up and be sure to stick around. I'm going to hit on a number of concepts in this video. We'll talk about the basics of Bitcoin transactions. What are the different components? We'll talk about public-private key cryptography, which really sits at the heart of Bitcoin security. We'll talk about different participants in the Bitcoin network, users, nodes, miners, and then we'll talk about how all of that comes together in the life cycle of a Bitcoin transaction and in achieving this kind of decentralized consensus, which is really the magic of this magic internet money. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Great to have you here. I hope you enjoy this video, and if you do, consider subscribing so that this video will make it to more of you who are seeking to be financially sovereign, which is really the whole point of this entire channel. And so again, excited to be with you as always. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. All right, so let's cover some of the key concepts. And first, I want to start with the composition or anatomy of a Bitcoin transaction. And we'll start super high level. I think a lot of folks can kind of intuit this just given how we conduct transactions every day, no matter what medium of exchange we're using. But ultimately, you have three main pieces of a Bitcoin transaction. You have inputs. So these are the funds, and the origination of the funds. So let's say that a buddy of mine wants to send me some Bitcoin. His Bitcoin are the inputs into that transaction. You then have the amount that he or she wishes to send to another participant in the network. And then finally, you have outputs. So this is the destination of the transaction. And so my buddy sending me Bitcoin, those Bitcoin that were inputs for him in that transaction now become what are called unspent transaction outputs for me. And so now I can take that unspent transaction output and in turn spend it to someone else. And we can see in this diagram how this starts to kind of link together, starting with Joe in the top left. Joe would like to send Alice some Bitcoin. He sends Alice 0.1 Bitcoin. So that input that started for Joe becomes the output that Alice now has. There is a small transaction fee, as we'll discuss. This is part of the reward that miners gain in exchange for taking transactions and putting them into blocks such that they will become fully acknowledged and validated by the network, and such that the transition of ownership will have been cemented. But now, this Alice now has these Bitcoin that she can in turn spend to others. And so if we go down to the second row, we can see how that works. Alice is now taking the Bitcoin she received from Joe and is forming those as inputs into this second transaction where she wants to pay Bob 0.015 Bitcoin. And because she's not spending the full amount of that previously unspent transaction output, she'll actually get change back in return. And then the difference between the inputs and outputs, again, you have the transaction fee, and so on and so forth. And so we can kind of see how these transactions get strung together. The other important concept as part of this is a wallet. So a wallet is just a piece of software that allows us as users on the network to interface and send and receive funds. There's lots of different types of wallets. Indeed, on this channel, I cover a lot of different kind of hardware wallets. There's desktop wallets, mobile wallets, etc. But ultimately, a wallet just allows you to interface with your funds. And specifically, the wallet is where we store the public-private key. And so let's talk about that next as the kind of one central pillar of Bitcoin security. So let's talk about public and private keys, which in combination with cryptographic hash functions really sits at the foundation of Bitcoin security. And this is what allows us to mathematically verify ownership of funds as opposed to needing a trusted third party to do so, such as my bank saying that, hey, this is Ian's account, etc. So as we were just discussing, different components of a transaction, and then you have wallets that allow us to send and receive funds, and that wallet is what generates the private and public keys. A private key is really just a randomly generated number, and it's kind of a massive, 256-bit kind of number. So said another way, it's essentially impossible to kind of guess it. And that private key allows us to uniquely generate an associated public key. And the way to think about these are your public key is kind of like your bank account information that let's say you want to send funds to a relative overseas. You'll need their account number, you'll need other information that ensures you can get the funds to their correct destination. That information is like your public key. The private key is more akin to a secret or PIN code that only you as the sender of the funds knows, and that will never be revealed to the receiver of funds. The number of graphics that I'm going to go through in this video are from Andreas Antonopoulos' Mastering Bitcoin, which I will link in the description down below. It's an excellent wealth of knowledge if you're curious to dig into some of this more. But to recap what we just said, I'm just going to kind of directly read this piece. A Bitcoin wallet contains a collection of key pairs, each consisting of a private key and a public key. The private key, as we were just saying, is a number, usually picked at random. From the private key, we use elliptic curve multiplication, a one-way cryptographic function to generate a public key. I'm not going to go into the details of elliptic curve multiplication in this video, but that is in the materials that I'll link in the description if you are so curious as to the gory detail there. And from the public key that we've just now created, we use another cryptographic hash function to generate the actual Bitcoin addresses. And so in previous videos, if you've watched on this channel, I'll go through different Bitcoin wallets. And in order to receive funds to those wallets, you will generate Bitcoin addresses, which are achieved by the public key. So the wallet creates the private key. The private key uniquely creates the associated public key. And the public key is what creates the Bitcoin addresses. And really, there's no way for me to kind of reverse engineer that. So there's no way computationally for me to say, here is a public key and know or figure out the private key that was used to generate that public key. Hence the sort of one-way of the one-way cryptographic function. On that note, because it is very important, let's look at just what that kind of conceptually looks like. So a hash function is essentially a mathematical function that takes some arbitrary length input and produces a fixed length output. So said another way with an actual example, let's say that the input are the characters Rhino, the characters that spell out Rhino. I pass Rhino through the cryptographic hash function, and I get this fixed length kind of alphanumeric output, and so on and so forth. And you can even see that some of these are extremely similar, right? The white rhino runs into the hungry hippo. The white rhino runs into the hungry hippo. And despite those inputs being nearly identical, they produce what appear to be wildly different outputs. And that's kind of the whole magic here. So these cryptographic hash functions produce unique outputs for different inputs, and they appear completely different. There's no rhyme or reason to this, except there is. It's just that we can't reverse engineer those outputs and figure out the inputs that were used to create them. So said another way, right, in summary, all of this allows us to, again, mathematically verify the ownership of funds. If there's no way for me to be presented with a public key and know the private key associated with it, this ultimately allows me as a user on the network to digitally sign transactions using my private key, and then have another participant on the network easily verify that the resulting kind of public key and digital signature could have only been produced by the owner of the public key. That's kind of the key concept. There's only, the person who has correctly applied this digital signature along with the public key to this transaction, they have to have the ownership of the private key, or else there's no way mathematically they could have been able to do that. So all of this is about mathematically verifying ownership of funds. With that out of the way, let's move on now to the different participants that I've started to allude to on the network. Right, so we've talked about the composition of transactions. We've talked about how public-private key pairs allow us to mathematically verify the transfer of ownership of funds within this kind of system without needing a trusted third party. So let's now flesh out a little bit more on the different participants within the network that actually makes this happen. Different people are going to cut this different ways. Technically speaking, as per this kind of visual, you have nodes, right, which are just computers running the Bitcoin software. So these are computers following the rules of the Bitcoin protocol, and they may have different roles depending on the kind of functionality they're supporting, right? There's wallet functionality, as we just discussed. There's mining, there's holding and storing the full entirety of the blockchain, and there's routing transactions in the network. But a more simplistic kind of view of this would just be there's users, right? So there's you and I who are trying to either send or receive Bitcoin, fine. There's nodes, which as I just said are computers that are typically going to be validating transactions and propagating transactions to the network. And so let's say that again, my buddy wants to send me Bitcoin. He, using his wallet, packages that into a transaction. That transaction needs to get broadcast out to the network through a node. And the node is looking and inspecting that transaction and is saying, okay, yep, it meets these criteria that we've all kind of agreed to use. It has the appropriate information, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to pass this along to one of my peers that I'm connected to. The next node receives that, checks it, looks at it. Yep, okay, this checks out, and propagates it further to the network. So the node is what's kind of validating these initial transactions that are coming in from users like you and I. And then lastly, you have what we might call a specialized node that are the miners. And the miners are machines that are picking up all these different transactions that users in the network are propagating. Right, so again, buddy wants to send me Bitcoin. He packages that into a transaction using his wallet and propagates that to the network through nodes. Now a miner can pick up any of those yet to be confirmed transactions from what's called a memory pool. So you send your transaction in and it sort of sits there until a miner picks it up. And a miner is going to pick up different transactions and put it into a block. And what they're doing is all sorts of verification in this. They're also executing on the proof of work, which demonstrates that there has been real energy used to ensure the security and validity of these transactions, which helps prevent against spam attacks on the network. And so that's really sort of it in a nutshell. We're going to talk about this in more detail in a kind of process flow next, but ultimately, you have users that initiate transactions. The transactions get propagated and initially validated by nodes. Miners pick transactions up once they've been propagated through the nodes. And then a miner is the one who packages transactions into a block to be put next onto the blockchain. And once that block is properly packaged, the nodes are also the ones who are saying, okay, yes, there is the proper proof of work that has been conducted to ensure that this is not a miner trying to put in fraudulent transactions that benefits him or her. So in that explanation, of course, we touch on blockchain. In this channel, I exclusively cover Bitcoin, but blockchain is, of course, a more general kind of concept. It's really just a public ledger that can be decentralized. And in the Bitcoin blockchain, as we can see, each block contains a variety of information. The block size, so like literally the size of the block. A block is really just a data structure. This is all information. You have the block header, which includes various important kind of meta information. You also have kind of the previous block hash, so that you know what, how to sort of connect this to the blockchain. And you, of course, have like the transactions themselves. And so implied in this is that there is a fixed size of a block. Like there's a limit on the size of a block of 1 megabyte for Bitcoin. And this was the source of what you might hear as the block wars several years ago, where there was a hard fork of Bitcoin with Bitcoin Cash, where they said, hey, we want bigger block size in order to run more throughput, more transactions through the network. Whereas the proponents of Bitcoin said, no, we don't want bigger block sizes because that's going to compromise the security and decentralized nature of the network. Because if you have bigger block sizes, then you're going to need heavier duty equipment other than just the little personal block that I've got running here in the back. Right, that anyone can run that, but if you increase the block size, you suddenly need more specialized equipment, and so you'll have more centralization, less decentralization. So pretty interesting kind of sidebar there. So we've hit on a number of concepts. Let's now try and pull it all together into kind of a process diagram and follow how a Bitcoin transaction works. All right, it's time to put it all together. Everyone loves a good process flow diagram. So we're going to follow Nick's quest to send half a Bitcoin to his friend Rose. Nick really likes Rose. So where that starts is Nick opens up his Bitcoin wallet, which is the software that allows him to engage with the funds that are associated with the private key of his wallet. He will need a Bitcoin address from Rose. Right? So Rose has her own wallet. The wallet has created a private key, which has created the public key, which allows her to generate these receive addresses. And so Nick's now going to use that receive address, which is connected to Rose's public key, to send her Bitcoin. He's going to specify the amount. He's going to specify the fee for the transaction. Not all wallets allow this. Some wallets allow the user to customize fees. Others don't. The reason this matters is if you attach a higher fee to your transaction, a miner is going to be more likely to pick that up as part of the next block. If you put the transaction fee all the way at zero, there's nothing wrong with that from a kind of protocol level, but you might have to wait a very, very long time for a miner to pick that transaction up, if ever, right? So Nick's now constructed the transaction using his wallet. He now uses the private key associated with that wallet to sign the transaction. And he sends that transaction off through nodes to be propagated through the network. So the transaction is now inspected, validated by the different nodes that say, all right, does this meet different criteria? Is this, valid in the sense that this is associated with the person who, who must own the private key, right, given the nature of the digital signature that's applied. And then once it's been propagated mostly through the network, a miner can then pick that transaction up and put it in the next block to be mined and attached to the blockchain. We're now at the calculating hash mining time step. I've decided that I'm just going to probably end up doing a totally separate video on exactly what's happening in this step, but at a very high level, the miner is conducting, millions upon billions upon trillions upon quadrillions of hashes to generate an output, right? We went through that cryptographic hash function earlier. So they're trying to conduct that cryptographic hash function on this block of transactions in order to produce a certain output that meets certain criteria, which is really, 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 really hard to meet. That's where I'm going to leave that explanation for now. But again, this ultimately requires the expenditure of real kind of energy and computation. And then finally, on this bottom row, the miner who solves that proof of work puzzle, i.e. they generated all these hashes that eventually got them to an output that is, meets this target or is less than this target, they are now able to propagate that new block to the network. And so they say, hey, we solved this. Look at our work. You can prove that we did it. You can prove that we put in this expenditure. And so that miner who solves that, essentially puzzle is now rewarded through both the transaction fees that were attached to the transaction, as well as what's called the block subsidy. And the block subsidy is essentially the new issuance of Bitcoin, which is built directly into the protocol. That new issuance is cut in half every 4 years. And so currently the block subsidy is 6.25 Bitcoin per block. So the miner is getting that who solves the proof of work. The nodes then look at that block that the miner has produced, and they're inspecting it to ensure that the contents are valid, the transactions are sound, there's no funny business going on. And again, this is all really important. This whole system operates with this principle that it is extremely difficult to kind of fake the system or to, put forth a block that is, that's fraudulent, right? You have to expend a lot of energy just to produce this block. And if it's fraudulent, it's super easy for nodes to detect that. So extremely difficult to produce a block, extremely easy for nodes to verify the contents of the block. And that's what's so powerful about the whole system. Once the nodes verify that this block is in accordance with the protocol, Rose will then see that the transaction has its first confirmation. And then the whole process repeats itself with miners picking up other transactions. And as new blocks get stacked on top of the block that Rose's transaction is in, you'll get further confirmations that further crystallize that transaction in the Bitcoin blockchain. And so that feels like a lot of steps because we're kind of talking through it in some degree of detail. But what this ultimately allows for is this decentralized consensus. Like, how do we get everyone in the network to agree that Nick, who previously really did own that 0.5 Bitcoin, has really transferred the ownership of that Bitcoin to Rose, who now truly owns that 0.5 Bitcoin? Like, how do we get everyone to agree on that? It's through this series of processes of kind of independent verification that happens on the network. So you first, again, have that independent verification of each transaction by the different nodes. So let's make sure that Nick has packaged this transaction correctly. He indeed is the owner of the funds that he is purporting to send. Secondly, you then have the mining nodes who are coming in and aggregating those transactions and demonstrating real computational expenditure through that proof of work where they're guessing all these different hashes in order to prove that real work has gone into this, which makes fraud extremely expensive on the Bitcoin network, because you're going to go out and spend all this kind of energy producing a new block only to have the nodes in this third step say that nope, like it's easy to validate that the transactions are fraudulent. So very, very difficult to generate a new block, easy to verify if that block is robust and the transactions within it. And that's, again, part of the incentives built into the protocol. And then lastly here, nodes are guided by the version of the blockchain that has the most cumulative computation done. So if there's ever a case where maybe two miners, both solve the proof of work puzzle at almost the same time, and so you kind of have these two versions of the truth. One transaction may actually be in both of those blocks that the two miners have packaged. You simply need to wait just a little bit more time, and then one of those chains is going to become longer than the other, and that longest chain ultimately wins out. So let's go ahead and leave this here, and we'll go ahead and close the video out in our conclusion. All right, gang, so there you have it. We covered a lot of ground as always, and as promised. Just to recap, we went through the basics of Bitcoin transactions. We went through public-private key cryptography, participants within the network, and how all of that comes together in a kind of life cycle of a Bitcoin transaction, and ultimately achieving this kind of decentralized consensus about who owns what. I hope you found this video useful. It's pretty difficult to calibrate the depth of these types of videos, given the diverse range of where folks stand on the learning curve. But let me know what you thought in the comments down below. If you want to go deeper on some of these topics, I can certainly do future videos where we go kind of even more deep and technical into some of these aspects. There is a ton of information, right? Like there's no possible way to even do most of this justice in a single video. And so let me know if you want to go deeper on any of these topics. Similarly, let me know if this was just totally wildly over your head. And I can certainly look to repackage some of this in a more kind of synthesized, higher level form. But in any case, regardless of where you stand on that spectrum, I hope you found something in this video valuable. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like so that, again, it can reach more folks, more plebs in their journey and quest to stack sats and become financially sovereign. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave this video here. As always, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you there.